entering today's arena is Ben Pinnington, joining me, who is the Managing Director of Polaris Media Management. And he was also very courageous and bold to publish a book, which I would say is quite a trailblazer for our industry, called Making Waves, PR Strategies to Transform Your Maritime Businesses. And today we will be making waves, hopefully. Welcome to the broadcast, Ben.
Thank you very much indeed. It's great to be here.
It's such a pleasure, and this is a topic that is very close to my heart. And as we were discussing just before the show went live, it's quite debatable within the maritime industry of how we go about PR and whether we need it, often misguided and misunderstood. I'll ask the audience to maybe share some comments and thoughts on how they would define PR at this moment, and maybe we can see if the opinion changes by the end of this broadcast. So everybody feel free to start sharing comments and any questions that you may have. Another thing that, as we promised, we will be giving out today a signed copy of Ben's book, so feel free to DM us for the free copy, and anybody interested could also get an electronic copy of the book. But without further ado, I think let's go straight into the basics of defining PR from an expert in his field. May I also mention, of course, that Ben is a PR expert and strategist in maritime manufacturing, engineering, construction. So he does have a wider overview of how we can master this PR arena, rather. So go ahead, Ben, the floor is yours.
Well, you asked what is PR, and it's something that I thought a lot about for the book. And I also consulted with our Chartered Institute of Public Relations. And PR is a vastly misunderstood concept, but fundamentally it is about reputation. PR is about what you say, what you do, and what other people say about you. But by far the most important element of that is what you do. And I think more and more in this era, PR is about listening as much as it is about broadcasting a message. If we expect people to be influenced by what we say, then we have to show that we are listening to our stakeholders and that we are influenced by what they say. Then they are much more likely to become advocates of our message and deepen their relationship with us. And that is the ultimate aim of PR, is to deepen relationships and deepen support. And PR is not just an add-on to marketing. It's not just a sales tool. It's not just a tactic, an on-off tactic. It is fundamental to shaping the strategic direction of the organization. And it does that really by listening to trends in society and listening to trends in our industries, and feeding that back into the C-suite. And really, PR should not be something that an organization, say a PR firm, that it only uses on a reactive basis, or there's a PR department in some remote part of the building. It should be in the C-suite, and it should be fundamental to shaping the strategic direction, as I say. And it's also more than just media relations. You know, it's also about your ethos, your brand identity, your social media, all of your literature. So it's a discipline in its own right, more than anything else, and an underappreciated one, certainly in maritime.
Most definitely. I would fully agree with that. And you come into my next question. Actually, you said within organizations, and you're talking about C-suite, and often I believe it's quite as people assume that this is something, PR strategies is something that probably the larger organizations need, the more well-known ones that are kind of in the spotlight, either due to cost or due to the size of a company not really feeling that it's something they can utilize. Would you say this is true or false, and why, of course?
Well, I think definitely false, because every organization needs profile. I mean, you may have the best product in the world or the best service in the world, but if your target audience hasn't heard of it and hasn't heard of you, it's not going to buy your product. So small businesses need PR, and I think there's some horrifying statistic that 60% of small businesses fail within the first 3 years of their business. So there's no room for complacency in small business. Of course, PR is fundamental to big business, but it is to small business as well. And I think being strategic is actually very, very helpful to small business. A lot of small businesses will use PR as a sort of tactical tool without really understanding what success looks like, what they're trying to achieve. And so more and more now, we are saying to clients, you know, let's sit down, let's write a communication strategy so we understand what the objectives are, what the starting point of the campaign is, who the audiences are, what media is going to reach them, and how we're going to evaluate the campaign. So I think it is absolutely essential to small business as much as it is to large business.
Yeah, and actually later in the show we will be going into more detail on this, of course. But I would say there that maybe it's also a factor of the resources required at an initial stage, and some companies are more reluctant to engage in this process or understand it completely. So it would really be great to hear. And you have also given great emphasis on analyzing the strategies in your book, or how the role and how it can serve the business, especially small businesses. So maybe you would like to share a few words on what the book actually is about, what inspired you to do it, the things that you would like to be the takeaways, without, of course, spoiling what the book is about.
What inspired me to write the book was just love for the industry. I've worked in the media now for 20 years, but the first 7 of those were in newspapers and in politics. But when I first walked into a shipyard in 2008, I knew very little about the maritime industry, despite the fact I come from Liverpool. And I was absolutely hooked. The passion of the place, the vibrancy, it was just terrific. And so I've written the book out of love for the industry, but also frustration, because PR is not necessarily well understood in maritime. There's a lot of maritime businesses that are run by engineers who don't necessarily come from a marketing background, who don't value PR, who don't truly understand PR. They don't understand how to evaluate the campaigns, how to even manage the campaigns. So it was really that as well, that there was a big element of frustration that I can't just sit there in these meetings anymore and be having to, you know, convincing the owners that they've got to keep on going with the campaigns, or trying to help them to understand that it's a slow burn process. And if you see it as a sales tool, then it can't exist in isolation or a vacuum. You have to have infrastructure in place to proactively harvest the profile that PR creates. And that is probably the biggest takeaway one of the biggest takeaways I can give, is that often in business, people are looking to PR a bit like the magic golf club, you know, buy this new golf club and it's going to transform your game. And PR needs to be better understood. You know, it can generate sales. Of course it can generate sales. It can increase the value of your business for sale. It can have a multitude of benefits, but to generate sales needs infrastructure behind it. You need to be members of trade association. You need to be going to the trade fairs around the world, the terrific trade fairs. You need to be going to networking events. You need to have a proactive approach to sales. PR cannot work in a vacuum.
Exactly. And I think actually We've discussed this before, and as a brand strategist myself, what we were saying is that it's one thing to, of course, have the product and your brand and have the company there, but if you're not present where you have to be present, it's not really much use. So this shift in mindset is definitely much needed, and I would say this book should become a guided and trusted manual for not only the C-suite but anybody interested in this sector. So you talked about convincing the owners. So now I'd say, how about you convince me and pitch PR to me? Because some would argue that it's far from a necessity, especially for our industry. Others are more warm to it. So if you were going to make your case, say, before a panel of judges or a board, how would you convince them of the opposite? What would be those arguments?
Well, the best pitches are short, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to, it's like I say, you've got to promote yourself. You can have the best product in the world, the most talented team in the world, but if no one's ever heard of you, nobody's going to buy your product. Mm-hmm. And it really is as simple as that. So it is an absolute necessity. If you want to survive and thrive, you've got to promote yourself. It's also a necessity because, as I say, it's about listening. It's about being in touch and in tune with changes in the maritime industry and changes in society, so you can adapt your company strategy accordingly. So, for example, we've been advising clients this week about how maritime is becoming under greater scrutiny of the mainstream media, and this is a massive epochal change, and that means that organizations have to prepare for the media, potentially knocking on their door and asking them about decarbonization and asking them about their carbon footprint. And this sort of approach that the maritime sector has had for so long, the ostrich approach of plunging their head in the sand and low profile, and this idea, this aberration that you can choose to be low profile, that is an increasingly untenable position in today's era, where maritime is fundamental to the decarbonisation debate, and everybody has a voice on social media. I mean, only this weekend in the Times newspaper here in the UK, there was a report that maritime could be responsible for a fifth of carbon emissions, global carbon emissions, by 2050. And I think there was a BBC World report as well this week about the challenges that maritime has. So, we're advising our clients that there is this sea change, and that is the kind of trend that the PR company or advisor or manager, that is the kind of trend that they need to feed into the business to ensure that the business is prepared for these changes and has shaped its strategy accordingly and doesn't find itself in some kind of reputational funk.
And I lately we have quite a few incidents where maritime has made the headlines in maybe not so positive way, and quite a few issues that as you very correctly say, will be requiring a better PR or leveling up your game. And we will go into a few scenarios to pick your brain on some practical advice a bit later on in the broadcast. But one of the things that I was really curious on asking you about and putting things a little bit more into perspective is obviously the crew change crisis. 17 months or more down the line, we're still discussing it. It hasn't been resolved. There was a pledge. There were calls by all associations that were doing incredible work to get. We knew that our most valuable asset is at sea and we need to do whatever it takes. However, the message somehow wasn't getting through. So if you were to say practically, how could we have been using PR or use it to improve and maybe resolve this issue? What would be your thoughts and takes on that?
Well, I'm not sure it wasn't getting through. And I think, it's like with anything with PR. PR is a slow burn process. And it's a bit like we're expecting a sales result. You know, we're expecting governments to change something, and PR can't do that in isolation. It can exert pressure and raise profile, but it's up to all of the different maritime organisations to then go along to government and bang on the door. And you know, it's complex, the crew change crisis, because there's so many different countries involved, and it's trying to find the PR that reaches the decision makers in those countries, like the Philippines, like India, and then follow up with lobbying. I do think we've got to keep the issue front and centre. We've got to bear in mind that governments' in-trays are overflowing with COVID-related issues. So we have to emphasise to them why they should care about seafarers and maritime. And we've got to have a very clear message, because there's such a noise that we have to pierce through. So we have to have a very clear message about the pressure that seafarers are under. And we have to keep pressing the message and keep raising the profile. It's a slow burn process, Gina, PR, and it's not necessarily going to be a quick fix. I do think that finding the human stories is very powerful. So if we can find those stories, and we represent a seafarer charity, Liverpool Seafarer Centre, and we've been interviewing the CEO about the case studies that he has, people he's been speaking to. We're trying to find stories from the front line of the pressure that people are under, you know, 16-month contracts. I think the human story has to come through. It can't just be, you know, organisations, International Chamber of Shipping, although they're doing a fantastic job, don't get me wrong, but it can't just be the institutions and sort of political figures. We need to hear from the seafarers themselves. We need to tell their story. And then we may start to pierce through and reach the governments. But it's not easy, because a lot of these countries, like, as I say, India, they're hard to reach, and they've got immense challenges. So we just got to try and keep going. I mean, I know here in the UK, for example, a successful campaign was the Gurkha campaign that was fronted by Joanna Lumley, who's a well-known figure here in Britain. So perhaps we need to think a bit more creatively as well, you know, try and get some well-known and respected public figures to back the campaign. You know, think creatively, just different ways to keep this in the public eye.
Do you feel one of my initial insights, we're actually stating the obvious, that seafarers are key workers, which for us is quite well understood. We're in the core industry, we know exactly what the industry does. And I feel that at times this is also in a way a result of keeping this low profile, because we had to kind of start from scratch in building the case on, so what do these people do and why is it an issue? And I don't know, what would be your take on that as an expert?
I think, you know, it's a huge problem. Maritime's low profile comes back to bite it and backfires in situations like this. I think the Maritime Foundation undertook a survey a few years ago in the port of Southampton, one of the biggest ports in Britain, asking the local people how many of the visible goods coming in and out of Britain came by ship, and hardly anybody knew the answer, that it is 95%, and that's in a port city. So there is enormous ignorance, there's enormous sea blindness, and the only way we can tackle that is by being bolder and finding our industry champions. We are so faceless, and it hammers us. How is it that our industry, one of the greatest industries in the world, steeped in human exploration, brimming with entrepreneurs, you know, how is it that we don't have a face? And then we're looking at the tech industry and they're all battling it out with this space race because they're really good at PR, they're shrewd at PR. And there's us, fundamental to global trade, and we have no voice, we have no big face, we have no entrepreneurial face. Okay, you know, Some of the institutions do a great job, but what about the businesses? You know, we're fortunate actually here where I am in the northwest of England, you know, that we do actually have well-known maritime figures locally. You know, think about Bibby Line in Liverpool, to Michael Bibby, to John Tibberet, who ran Camel Laird Shipyard. They became very well known on Merseyside, but how well known were they outside Merseyside? And you know, we need to find those people, because the entrepreneurs are those who are exciting. You know, they're the people who are trying to change the world. They're the people who are innovative. They're the people who can champion maritime as this cutting edge, innovative industry that's at the sharp edge of cutting carbon emissions, of AI, of smart shipping. You know, we have such a great story to tell. And it is just, it is an aberration that we don't tell it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that, as you well know my opinion on this. Actually, I think it's also quite important, as you said, that we need to be putting our story out there to start off with, and then building it, of course, to, especially during this so exciting times when there's so many things going on. I mean, we're talking about unmanned vessels, and there's great efforts happening within the industry on going green, which are unfortunately not highlighted as much as they could. And then we see situations like the Black Trail videos and different scenarios popping up. So I think what I would like to do now, and maybe, you know, given the opportunity that we're getting free PR advice during this broadcast, is maybe play something like a game. So I'll put the scenarios that we have recently seen, and maybe you can give us a few pointers. I know, of course, and I understand that some of them there's a confidentiality issue, and we need to be quite understanding of how the situation evolved. But just a few thoughts on your take on this, and how the industry going forward can be approaching similar kind of incidents or occurrences. So one of the things that struck me in the Black Trail incident was, in the first few minutes, I think they actually said that shipping is one of the largest polluter, if I'm not mistaken. And I was thinking, yes, nobody's actually making the case the other way around. And there were actually reporters outside. We saw reporters outside the IMO Secretary General house. So say he was actually calling you for advice on these questions. I'm just saying now, and you have him on the other end.
Well, say, how did you find it? How did you get yourself in this position in the first place where you got reporters outside your house?
Yeah, I think that won't be very helpful, but something a bit more.
Well, you know, I think if you've got a situation where you've got reporters outside your house, you want to diffuse that. Mm-hmm. So I would say go outside with some tea, coffee, biscuits, talk to them, make friends with them, but make it clear you're not doing an on-the-record interview. You cannot do an interview off the top of your head. You've got to prepare. And I would say he has to do the interview. You know, the IMO, if you're asking me to put my head above the parapet, the IMO represents our sector. It has set the 2050 target. It represents all of these different organizations and countries. So it can't be the paper tiger. You know, it has to stand up and put its side of the story. Now, we know that this was a bit of a hatchet job, the Black Trail, so it does come with risk. But it also comes with opportunity, that if you do the interview, you can put our side of the industry and start talking about all the exciting things and challenging them and saying, why are we just focusing on the negatives? Why can't we look at the positives? You know, I would respect you a lot more if you could talk to me about the positives of what we're doing, not just dwelling on the negatives, and perhaps accept that there are challenges within the 2050 targets. You know, be frank about that. Don't dodge that bullet, but say what we're going to do to try and tackle it. But more than anything else, we've got to, you know, I often say to the team here, the challenge of PR is to do your client justice, and sometimes you really have to bend your back to do the client justice. And it is the IMO's job, in my view, to do this industry justice. Now, that can't be that difficult. We have got such an exciting story to tell. It's not without challenges, but we've got to start exciting people about maritime. You know, you've got Branson, Musk, and Bezos going into space. The most talented people, young people today, they're going to want to go and work in tech. That's where it's all seemingly, that's where the excitement is. And unless we sell ourselves and show that you can make a difference to changing the world for the better by helping maritime to decarbonize, unless we start telling that story and all the fascinating engineering that's going on, you know, we are going to fall behind. You know, we that is our space exploration, discovery. That's our turf. You know, Magellan, Columbus, the discovery of America, the discovery of the Pacific. That was seafarers who did that. So we have to recover our mojo. And you know, and that's what I would say to the boss of the IMO. You know, let's not be tapping on the door of the media with a sponge. Let's get out there and be bold. And yeah, sure, we might have a few hiccups and we might make a few mistakes, but unless you're out there learning, you're not growing. And I think the concern for maritime is that we're getting dragged into the decarbonisation debate in the mainstream media, and we're not ready for it, Gina. We're not ready for it. And there's going to be some pretty embarrassed organisations around unless they can get a grip of their comms. And you know, perhaps I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think that improving the standard of communications is one of the biggest challenges facing maritime, along with decarbonisation, digitisation. And I would actually say, look at the editorial in Lloyd's List after Ever Given, and other places. You know, these were stinging editorials, and we've got to listen to this. We've got to get better at telling our story, and we've got a great story.
No, most definitely. I fully agree, and I mean, it's no longer optional whether we do it or not. I mean, we're engaged in this dance, I would say. So we need to make sure we know what we're doing and actually leading the way. Since you mentioned the Ever Given, obviously that was another major incident that made the news. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Bloomberg reported a huge ship blocked a canal, which was quite fascinating to me.
There was some fascinating responses. You know, somebody, a very intelligent person, said to me, "Why don't they just blow it up?" And it's like, well, it might have something to do with the billions of pounds worth of goods on there. That's not a good idea, but perhaps blocking the canal and all kinds of. But you know, just shows the ignorance out there. You know.
Indeed, it was actually quite shocking, but given that, I mean, it did come to the headlines and it was all over the place. And from a PR perspective, was there anything that you spotted that was actually done well? And if you're giving practical advice of how in such incidents, so not just taking the Ever Given, but when an incident happened that is making the news daily, how should an owner or manager be responding, or the port authorities in this situation?
Well, you know, listen, nobody's saying it's easy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wasn't directly involved in Ever Given, and from what I understand, it was very, very difficult. There were lots of different organisations involved with different attitudes and different approaches to PR, and that tied the PR people's hand behind their back. And that led to this stinging editorial in Lloyd's List and elsewhere. But, you know, we've really got to learn from that. You should be coming out of a crisis with your reputation enhanced. And unfortunately, that is not what happened with Ever Given. And I think it's a wake-up call. You know, we've got to do our crisis better. We can't just hide behind faceless updates. And, you know, rehearsals. I mean, again, I don't know what the crisis people did to prepare for this, but you've got to rehearse for a crisis and the different scenarios of a crisis. You should never face a crisis having not practiced it. And you need a front person. I mean, you know, if COVID teaches us anything, it is the importance of having regular updates, proper communication, a central place where people can get information, whether that's the company website or the Twitter feed, or there's going to be a press conference every day or every week. You know, you don't have to comment all of the time in a crisis, but you do have to comment consistently. And, you know, I've said this before, can you imagine, you know, a Virgin plane crashing, or, you know, even with the Virgin Galactic, the tragic incident where the plane crashed and killed the pilot. Branson was all over the media after that. And you've got to have people who can front up in a crisis. I mean, if God forbid there had been multiple casualties, I mean, look at the port of Beirut explosion. I mean, absolutely catastrophic and huge number of deaths, and actually talk about it in the book. You know, the threat of crisis and serious global crisis. You know, that's the biggest story in the world for a number of days. And you've got to have people. I mean, Maritime, you know, is under threat of a big crisis. So you've got to have people who can front up. You can't have, you know, a situation where nobody is talking to the media. But, you know, listen, it's not easy handling a crisis. It really isn't. But there are specialist organisations out there. It's a big section of my book, and you've got to take a very, very planned, strategic approach to crisis, and you've got to stand up to be counted more than anything else, and have an empathetic front person who can be sympathetic to any of the human side of the incident, and also, you know, sympathetic to the stakeholders as well, and not just, you know, communicating privately to the stakeholders, but also communicating publicly, because that's responsible. So I hope we've learned from that. You know, as I say, PR is about listening as much as it is about broadcasting a message, and we got a very strong message back from the media that the way Maritime is handling major incidents is inept. So we've got to improve that.
Yeah, I was actually thinking how, and thank you for mentioning it, actually, that the Ever Given, of course, made the news due to its size and the location, but we on a daily basis are also dealing with the incidents that involve the crew, that involve environmental matters, and there's a lot of sensitivities and balances that have to be, you have to be prepared for. So it's just, it's exactly what you said. It really needs a very strategic kind of thinking and approach when dealing with all of this these issues that come up from an incident or could arise.
Yeah.
And I also very much like what you said about having an empathetic spokesperson, because it does make all the difference. And I think also that not only what you're saying, but having the proper training and being able to put yourself in front of the media when they're asking you about casualties, or they're asking you about an oil spill, for example. I mean, it's very difficult what you should be saying.
Well, you know, I say that because so often where organizations go wrong is when they appear cold, detached, insensitive, uncaring to whatever the crisis is. Whether it's, you know, an oil well exploding in the Gulf of Mexico or a data leak. You know, if you don't show that you care about how that has affected your customers or the public, you are going to get pilloried. And it has happened. It has happened many times. And Maritime needs to be very careful that this low profile approach, how it can backfire. You know, you stick your head in the sand like the ostrich. You just want the problem to go away. And it may not be malicious, but it's interpreted as being cold and uncaring and possibly incompetent as well. So
I think it's being careful what to say without having exactly, you know, all the facts before you. Because I've been the media spokesperson for a company, which was quite interesting. And the examples that you say during our training, they were showing us some videos. So it was quite amusing to see how it can really go the wrong way when you're just trying to, you know, be wary of what you're saying and the
yeah, well, we saw that with Black Trail. I mean, you know, clearly these interviews were being undertaken off the top of the head, and it was incredibly sort of unplanned, and it backfired what was being said because it turned out to be quite undiplomatic. And you know, you kind of think, how can Maritime find itself in a situation where we're behaving like Churchill amateurs? You know, it's not rocket science. You need to prepare for a media interview. You need to understand why you're doing the media interview, and you know what success looks like in the media interview. What must you say? And it didn't seem that there was been really any plan of what some of those people were going to say. So again, okay, we've made the mistake. We see that Maritime has been dragged into the mainstream. We've made the mistakes. We've got to get better. You've got to learn from the mistake.
And I'll go back to one thing that you mentioned earlier about the T and the approaching the journalist in a specific way, because recalling actually my training now, that was another thing that they mentioned. Make sure that you're treating the journalist as if you're your friend and not the enemy, which is also obviously quite important in this case. So the press can be your friend if you know what you're doing, I believe.
Well, you should certainly respect the media. And I think, you know, what certainly Ever Given has shown us with the response from Lloyd's List, the editorial, and other titles, is they didn't feel respected. And, you know, the media can be a champion as well. And I think, you know, they were saying this in the Lloyd's List editorial, you know, Ever Given was an opportunity to champion the industry. We had the global media wrapped in the story, and it was a chance to, you know, use that as a springboard to, you know, champion the industry. And, you know, the media is there as a champion as well. And I think that's often underappreciated by organizations, certainly in my experience, that, you know, they don't, or they think that the media is just there to knock them, but it's not. You know, it's the media's job to write a negative story from time to time because that's news, but don't take that personally. The media is also there to promote your good news, and if you do promote your good news, you do proactively engage the media, it will generate a lot more positive headlines than negative. And then when you do get a negative story, maybe the media will be more sympathetic. And you know, look at all of the media awards. I mean, the Lloyd's List Awards, the Sea Trade Awards. I mean, Liverpool Echo here, Manchester Evening News, all the regional business awards. You know, it is absurd to think that the media is not there as a champion as well. And we know we deal with the maritime press virtually every day. We have one of the best trade press, if not the best trade press in the world, certainly one of the most abundant. And it's packed with you know, very knowledgeable journalists who want to come to your business and want to do tours and want to learn about you, want to learn about the innovation that you're doing. But too many businesses are not harnessing that. And it's such a missed opportunity. So the media is, is a champion, and it needs to be treated with respect.
Exactly. And now one last maybe scenario that you have touched upon on the decarbonization issue, and obviously all of this pressure by environmental groups. We actually even recently saw a landmark court decision with the Shell verdict, where they were actually ordered by court to reduce the carbon emissions, and a case brought to court by an environmental pressure group. And it's something apparently that we will be seeing going forward. And there's a lot of emphasis on ESG and obviously being aligned with the sustainability development goals. So from a PR kind of perspective, in similar positions like such a verdict, or when you're being under attack when it comes to environmental initiatives or strategies, how would you say we could manage such incidents, or even better avoid them, of course?
Well, I think ESG is a game changer. ESG is replacing CSR. CSR was a sort of soft world of, we do quite worthy things, give us some recognition. I mean, I've been slightly flippant there, but what I'm trying to say is that ESG is a much tougher game, and we see it with the Poseidon principles in Maritime, which represent lending institutions who account for, I think, half of maritime finance, about $158 billion. And what the Poseidon principles are saying is that if, as a ship owner, your ship is not meeting the IMO 2050 targets, GHG targets, your ship is not going to get mortgaged. Now, that is a tougher game altogether. So ESG is really important, and organizations need to get their PR together, and they need to show that their business is not just about purpose washing or greenwashing, but you actually stand for something. You are in tune with the decarbonization agenda, the climate change emergency agenda, and you are evolving and adapting all of your communications and operations to take account of this new normal. And PR is a really important part of that, because you need to be out there promoting what you are actually doing. This is not purpose washing. You need to be out there in the media showing giving evidence of the journey and the efforts you're making. It has to be authentic. And I say this in the book, you know, for God's sake, do not fall for the trap of greenwashing and purpose washing. You have got to be real. You've got to be for real in this new era, because you'll be clobbered. You'll be clobbered by the media and other organisations. I mean, we see Greenpeace staging protests at ports, for example. You know, you've got to walk the walk. My fear is that too many organisations are really not, and you know, a lot of organisations are really silent on decarbonisation, and they are the ones who are at risk of a crisis, and are at risk of also becoming uncompetitive and being left behind. I mean, the decarbonisation is worth what, 1.3 trillion, 1.9 trillion to decarbonise maritime. There's a pretty strong incentive to get involved in a serious way. But when I look around, if I'm honest, I'm surprised by how many maritime organisations, their operations, their comms, are not really embracing decarbonisation. And again, that's an area that businesses really have to look at.
Most definitely, and I mean, especially now going forward, the regulations will just be increasing. There's such an urge towards transparency and the way you are reporting. So it's more than manifesting a good PR strategy around it. It's directly related to business success, and actually the commercial aspect of being sustainable as an industry in whole. I would actually say you even touched upon the talent pool, and I think if we're not doing everything we can to present this industry as exciting, we will be facing also lack of human capital entering the industry who want to be joining more exciting and fascinating kind of scenes. And how should somebody be started? So what's the first thing that you would advise somebody to do if they want to enter this PR strategy process now?
Well, if you're going to undertake PR, the PR consultant has to understand what the strengths, opportunities, weaknesses, threats, the SWOT analysis of the business. It has to understand what the business is trying to achieve, and then understand the starting point. You know, where is the business now? What is the business's current profile? What is the relationship with the media? What is the profile on social media? How well known is your front person? You know, so you have to have a clear idea of what your starting point is, because then you can set objectives realistically. Your starting point is very low in the media, then using PR is going to be a slow burn process to change attitudes and behaviors and reach your stakeholders. So it's not going to be, you know, a bolt from heaven and suddenly, you know, everyone's championing you and the business is flowing in. It's going to take time to build your profile. But, you know, you just want to have a classic communication strategy, clear objectives, clear messages, who's the audience, what channels are going to reach your audience, the media, trade associations, trade fairs, e-newsletters, and, you know, what's your budget for it as well? And keep in mind that, you know, social media is a very time-consuming thing, and also senior management time is going to have to be factored into it if it's going to be any good. You know, it has to come from the top. I mean, that's absolutely critical in any PR campaign, that it has the authority and backing of the owner or the CEO in the C-suite. If it's handed down to middle management to drive, then it's clearly not a priority, is it? So to really work, it has to have the authority of the owner, and you also need to understand, you know, what risks are facing the organization. I think that's really important, you know, horizon scanning, so you can prevent any particular crisis, or at least be prepared. But get that strategy in place so you know what success looks like. And in my experience, you know, a lot of organizations are quite cavalier about having a communications plan. They just sort of want the PR company to get on with the job and get on with the tactics. But, you know, that sort of scattergun approach is not going to it can work to an extent, but it's not going to maximize the campaign. So, you know, big part of my book is to say, you know, make sure you're strategic, it comes from the top, and you have an understanding of what you're trying to achieve and what does success look like.
I really the discussion we could be having for hours, but I really don't want to spoil what you've included in the book for our audience, but definitely this is just such a powerful tool and needs to be used in the right way, and the C-suite and top management level need to be, as exactly as you said, just a part of this, because they're the ones that know the vision exactly, and there's only so much an agency can bring to the table if they're not participating and actively engaging within this process. So I understand from what you're saying that the first step that a company should be taking is obviously a self-reflection or a self-assessment of where they want to, what they are doing, where they want to be going. So that's quite important. And I know you've already touched upon it earlier and throughout today's discussion, actually. But maybe on a final note, as we're wrapping up slowly today's broadcast, how would you say, how would we implement the successful PR strategies? Like, is there a way to measure it? Is it measurable, or what would
Absolutely, absolutely. And the evaluation, I would say evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
Evaluation is one of the most underrated elements of the PR campaign. And, you know, as PRs, we have to get better at telling the story of the campaign. We're very good at telling the story of the client, but then we have to think about, what about the story of the campaign? What is the campaign achieving against its objectives? Because really, you know, you want to be, publicity, for example, is just an output. It's like, what is the impact of that publicity? So assess the quality of your coverage. Are you getting into the right media, read by the right target audience, with the right messaging? Social media, report the conversation that you're having in social media. Don't, as the industry calls it, data puke. It's not just about the likes and the retweets and the impressions. It's who's liking it, who's retweeting it, what support or otherwise are you getting on social media? Because, you know, if some of the messaging isn't quite hitting home, well, you can adapt your campaign accordingly, and that's why evaluation is really important. So you can adapt the campaign as you go along. And, you know, if a big part of PR is to change attitudes and to influence behavior, well, you have to ask your stakeholders. Say you want to highlight how you're going green and you're developing all of these green technologies, and historically you haven't been perceived as particularly green. Well, survey at the start of the campaign, then after 6 months, then after 12 months, then after 18 months, and ask your stakeholders, you know, are you aware of what we're doing? And just try and gauge how impactful a PR campaign is being. That's how you're going to measure the return on investment. It's not just necessarily about the business leads. You're trying to influence attitudes and behavior. And also a big thing which organizations don't do well, which they really do need to, is collecting anecdotal feedback. That in other industries, that is done extremely well. And you've got to capture those comments at trade fairs, in meetings, and put that in a central place. So that is gold dust, that kind of feedback, because that can tell you, you know, that can be a temperature check on, is this working? I mean, you might be running a campaign on social media. We did one a few years ago about all the different ships that we worked on. And I found when I went networking that people started saying to me, oh, you know, I saw this thing, you know, big next to this big massive ship. And this was not in a maritime context. This was a construction networking group. And I thought, this is really good, because people are starting to understand us better, the quality of work that we're doing, the nature of the work that we're doing. And that was really good anecdotal feedback, but you've got to log it. So you understand, you know, what progress you're making. And obviously sales, you've got to, the sales leads, and again, companies aren't particularly good at this, you know, asking, where did you hear about us? And if it's Tradewinds or Lloyd's List or C-Trade, well, that's pretty important that we're aware that, if, you know, those publications are gaining traction. But really, you know, if PR is working, it should be like a force behind you. You know, it can generate business leads. It can be like that ship that can take you from your island of existing contacts to new continents of new people, new opportunities. It can raise the value of your business for sale. It can raise your price points. It can help you win awards. It can help you to attract staff and talented suppliers. There are a multitude of benefits, but you've got to document it. You've got to evaluate it. So yeah, I'd say implementation is all about evaluation.
No, the show convinced us that it's all about shipping and it's all about PR, and definitely time for Maritime to steer that PR wheel correctly and get the story right. Of course, we would like to hear audience feedback, so do feel free to share in DMs or in comments any thoughts on today's session, which we could be discussing for a few hours. But with that, I think we can wrap up the show and leave the rest to people to read through your book and maybe even reach out to you if they have some questions and need some.
I think we were going to offer some as a prize, weren't we? I think we got five copies.
Exactly. As mentioned at the beginning of the show, we will be giving out 5 copies of the book. So send us a DM. Send me or either Ben if you want to reach out directly. Feel free, that's fine with me. And say that you're interested in the free book, and we'll make sure it gets to you. Definitely a very, very useful manual. Or alternatively, I'll also make sure I'll share the Amazon link below this video for anybody who's interested in buying it. I think Ben is on a mission to make it a bestseller on Amazon, and I'm sure it will become. One definitely.
It has already. It's probably immodest of me to say this, but it has already become a PR book bestseller on Amazon. But I'm not quite challenging J.K. Rowling yet on the general figures.
I think for a trailblazing book like that in PR in such a niche industry, which is not quite hasn't quite come to terms with it, that's amazing. So congratulations, and I'm sure it's definitely highly recommended by me. And I think there's a lot of great advice in there, and a lot of things that we should really start making use of ASAP, especially through this disruptive times of in the shipping industry. It's no longer optional. Thank you very much, Ben, for being on today's broadcast. Ben Pinnington, who's the founder and managing director of Polaris Media Management, and of course the author of Making Waves, PR Strategies to Transform your Maritime Business. And thank you to everybody for logging into today's It's All About Shipping, powered by Oceans Arena.